No, there's enough to last for an hour.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll get started.
Yeah, there's quite a lot to get through. So we'll talk about everything, and then we'll leave the questions at the end.
Yeah. So, welcome to Journey to Medical School. Thanks for joining us. Just a bit of the structure. So, Harry will start off by talking about Auckland Pre-Med, which is the Biomed and Health Sci first years. Then I will do the equivalent for Otago Health Sci first year. We'll also do a bit of an intro about ourselves at the start, and then we'll do UCAT, MMI, and questions at the end.
Awesome. So just getting started by a bit about us. My name's Harry, and I'm a undergraduate fifth year medical student. So I graduated from Westlake Boys High School in 2019. Went to biomed first year, got into second year med, second year, third year, fourth year. Now I'm a fifth year. That picture of me is a picture of me giving a seminar at Middlemore Hospital last year. And
I'm Chanel, so I did Otago Health Science first year a couple years ago. I didn't get into med first go, and I'll talk about why I didn't later in the seminar. So I completed a bachelor's degree in biomedicine, and then I applied to postgrad med, got offers from both unis, and ended up accepting Auckland. So now I just finished my second year of med school.
awesome. So getting right into it. Pre-med, Auckland versus Otago. Yeah, so just before we get started, I just want to say that if you've done some high quality preparation over summer and, in the past, I would tend to say that getting into Auckland Med School is slightly easier compared to Otago Med School just because of the way the year works, and we'll get more into that very soon when we talk about the timeline of your year. But basically, this seminar is focused on general category first year, and you might wonder what that means. So, this is the total number of proportion of students accepted into Auckland Medical School by the category. So every year, the government allocates around 300 spots for medical students, and out of those 300 spaces, roughly half of them's people from the general category, and roughly half of them are people from the sort of alternative category. So around 20% out of the 300 are people who's applying under the Māori and Pacifica entrance scheme. Around 20% of them is people from a rural background, and a tiny proportion of them would be people who qualifies under disability and refugees and low social economic status. But in today's, and if you are qualified with any of those categories, then usually the GPA, the grade point average, the grade that you need to get into medical school is usually a bit lower. But in today's seminar, we're going to be focusing on the general category. So for you guys watching, assuming that most of you guys are coming straight from high school into first year, you guys would be the general first years. So roughly a third, which is about 100 spaces, 100 students from the general first years, people from biomed or health science at Auckland Uni are accepted into medical school every year. And the 50 students that you see there, general category graduates, someone like Chanel who's completed a degree, then applied to medical school, around 50 of them usually every year. All right, so Auckland Pre-Med, Biomed, and Health Science. As a proportion of your application to med school, if you're applying either under Biomed or Health Science, 60% of your application would be allocated to GPA or grades or grade point average, which I'm going to go into and explain to you exactly what that means. 15% of them's allocated to the UCAT and 25% allocated to the interview. And there's a multiple mini interview, and this is at Auckland Pre-Med. At Otago, there's no interview. So, just before we get into your timeline, just want to talk a bit about grades, and you might wonder why it's outlined as it's being read. That's because most people who's applying to medical school, they know about the UCAT, most people know about the interview, and most people, they have a idea that they have a concept of the grades because they've done high school grades and they've done scholarships and things like that. But the point that we're going to be trying to hopefully hone into you guys today is that in order to get the same grades or excellent grades in uni, it's very difficult. It's way more challenging compared to high school. And grades are actually the most important component in terms of getting into medical school at Auckland Uni, because there's two reasons. Obviously, the first reason is that it's 60% of your application. And the second reason is that your UCAT and interview doesn't actually get looked at by the uni unless your GPA or your grades are high enough to a particular level comparison to the rest of your year. So let's just talk a bit about the pre-med timeline. So the year actually, I should say, spans from March to November. Usually the first week of March, well, that's you there, the stick man. There's semester 1 and semester 2. Usually the year starts in the first week of March. You have around 5 to 6 weeks, and then you get a week or two of the break. I think the break is 2 weeks now, the mid-semester break. And then after the mid-semester break, you have another 2 to 3 weeks, which is usually where the first test takes place. And now this first test is worth somewhere between 20 to 30%. Some courses it's around 20%, some courses it's around 30%. And then you get another couple of weeks, and then you've got your final exams for the semester. And final exams usually around 3 to 4 weeks. And then you've got an inter-semester break, which is 3 to 4 weeks. And then you have semester 2. And then at the end of sem 2, obviously, you also have the exam season at the end. And somewhere at the start of semester 2, at the end of your semester break, start of semester 2, you take your UCAT. And then in the mid-semester break, you'll do the interview. In the past, the interview used to be near the end of the year after your exam finishes in semester 2, but then in recent years they've decided to move it forward to in the middle of the semester. Alright, so that's the timeline. So let's just talk a bit about biomed to begin with. In semester 1, so in each semester you have 4 courses that you have to take. So in semester 1, you have a paper called Biosci 107, which is just pretty much everything about cells and kind of year 13 NCEA level 3 biology, but in much more detail. Or if you're doing Cambridge or IB, it's just the highest level of IB or Cambridge qualifications that you're doing, but in much more detail. And then there's Population Health 111, which is kind of the topic that you don't really delve in high school. It's epidemiology, so it's about how diseases occur and how to calculate kind of statistics and things like that in terms of a population approach when it comes to looking at how diseases occur. So this is kind of a topic that's quite unfamiliar for most high school students usually. And then there's a paper called Chemistry 110. So it's basically organic chemistry, well, not just organic chemistry, other parts of chemistry as well. It's kind of like year 13 chemistry, but again, into much more detail. And then there's another one called Gen Ed, which stands for General Education. So it's kind of like an elective paper that people pick. Is it still going on? Mm-hmm. Just checking. Yep. An elective paper that students take, that the uni kind of suggests that students take a paper to kind of broaden their horizons, but usually, if you're in a biomed context, you would kind of pick a paper that's really easy to get an A+ on, just so that it can relieve your load, so that you can focus on the papers that matters the most. And then in semester 2, you have these 3 papers: Biosci 106, Biosci 101, and Physics 160. And then you have a paper called MedSci 142. Now, you might be wondering, why are there's 4 papers that's bolded. There's Biosci 107, Pop Health 101, Chem 110, and MedSci 142. They're bolded. The reason they're bolded is that these are the common papers that is the same between biomed and health science, and it's known as the core papers. And we'll go into that very soon, but let's just go through health science first year at Auckland Uni first. So, in semester 1, there's the same 3 core papers: Biosci, Pop Health, Chem, and then there's a paper called Population Health 101. Basically, it's just, from what I've heard, I did biomed myself back in first year, but from what I've heard from my peers, it's lots of essay writing and assignments. That's usually how that particular paper is being examined. There's also exams at the end as well. And then in semester 2, there's a paper called Health Psych 122, Population Health 102, and also a Gen Ed. And like I've mentioned before, MedSci is the shared paper in semester 2. So we've established that the bolded papers are core papers. Now, why is that important? That is because out of the 60% component of your application to med school, the GPA, the uni only looks at these 4 core papers: Biosci 107, Population Health 111, Chemistry 110, and MedSci 142. Now you might be wondering, so if the uni only looks at these 4 bolded core papers as part of the 60%, or completely the 60% of my grade component to medical school, what's the point of these other kind of random papers here? I'll give you guys 10 seconds to think about it, and then I'm just gonna have a drink of water.
Could mention the IB.
Yep, I would. Hopefully you all have an answer in your mind. The reason for those papers is there's actually not much use for these papers apart from 2 reasons or 2 purposes. So according to the University of Auckland, there's 2 criteria that you have to fulfill in order to be eligible, in order for the uni to even look at your application to medical school. The first one is that you have to pass every single one of these 8 papers, regardless of whether you're in biomedical health science. So if you fail any single paper, if you fail any single one of them, you're not eligible. If you lodge an application, the uni's not going to look at it. That's number 1. Number 2, you have to have an average grade point average of a 6.0, or a B+ average across all 8 of your papers. So if you passed all your papers, but you have a grade point average of less than a 6 or less than a B+, then the uni will look at your application and be like, no, we're not going to look at it. We're not going to look at his or her core paper grades, because those 2 criteria, one of them's not satisfied, not fulfilled. Yeah, so that's the only purpose of these non-core papers. It's not bolded. Apart from that, as long as you pass all of them, as long as you have an average grade point average over these 8 papers of a B+ or above, then all that matters is the 4 core papers that's in bolded. And I'm going to explain to you what grade point average means right here, because we'll be talking about grades all this time. So grades, or GPA, grade point average, it's basically a number that your university grades for a particular paper is being converted into in order for the uni to calculate your grades and for it to basically standardize across all the students. So an A+ is converted into a 9, an A is converted into an 8, an A- is converted into a 7, and then so on and so forth. And in order to get an A+, it's anything above 90%. So you have to score above 90% in the entire course, the entire paper, for you to attain an A+ in that particular paper. And then it will be 85 to 90% for an A, 80 to 84% for an A-, and so on and so forth. Shouldn't really be thinking about anything below a B+, because yeah. So there you go. And we've been talking about grades for the past 15 to 20 minutes, and now you might be thinking, what's the grade that you need, what's the GPA that you need to get into medical school or to be kind of relatively competitive? Now, we've collected some data from the University of Auckland, and this is data spanning back to sort of 9 or 10 years ago. If you ignore the 3 COVID years, 2020, 2021, and 2022, you can see that the median GPA for a student who's accepted into medical school from first year sort of general undergraduate category is spanning between around an 8.5 or 8.75. So if you want to think about it, in order for you to be relatively competitive, in order for you to be the middle person in terms of everyone who's accepted into medical school, you have to have at least an 8.5 or 8.75 GPA. And that means that you have to have at least 2 A+ and 2 A's, or 3 A+ and an A in the 4 of your core papers. So that means that, an 8.5 is a 9 because an A plus is a 9, and 9 plus 9 plus 8 divided by 4, the average of your grades, which is an 8.5, and for an 8.75, that's 9 plus 9 plus 9 plus 8 divided by 4, that's 8.75. Hopefully that makes sense. Yeah. And then just some extra information about the lower quartile GPA. It's also spanning somewhere between at least an 8, and recent years it's been a bit higher. We couldn't find the 2023 data from last year. But, if you look at these two tables here, you have to have at least an A average, if not like above an A average, in order for you to be reasonably competitive in order to apply for medical school. Now, again, like I mentioned at the start, if you're applying under the rural category or the MAPAS category, Multi and Pacific Entrance Scheme, or anyone who qualifies for disability or refugees or low social economic status, then usually the GPA is a bit lower. Depends on the category. If you want to look it up, you can go online to look it up. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that 3 of your core papers is in semester 1. That means that if you want to strategically think about getting an 8.5 or an 8.75, which is 2 A pluses or 3 A pluses, you would want to, the most strategically kind of easy way to do it would be try to focus your effort in semester 1, which is between March and June, sort of 3 to 4 month period. Get 3 A pluses. The reason that we usually don't recommend people thinking about, some people might think, yeah, there's still MedSci 142 and Sem 2. I can kind of just, if something goes wrong, I can just kind of work hard at MedSci and try to get an A plus. The reason is that MedSci 152 is actually the most difficult paper in this whole semester, and usually historically only around 5% of the students get an A plus for MedSci 142. So if you're thinking about making it up with MedSci 142, then the odds are really against you. So just trying to hone in the point that if you want to have a competitive and reasonable chance at going for medical school, you really want to focus on that semester 1 and getting 3 A pluses in those BioSci 107, population health, and chemistry. All right, now let's just focus back on these 4 papers now, because those are the most important ones. Now, you might be thinking, first, just before we get into it, you might be wondering which papers are the easiest and which papers are the hardest in semester 1. So obviously MedSci 142 is the most content heavy. And out of the ones in semester 1, from the consensus that I've had from the juniors that I've spoken to and my peers, usually chemistry 1 tends the easiest one, because it's mostly about practicing and kind of just lots of doing exercises and practicing papers. And this is the paper where, I'm sure some of you have heard of, there's an advantage that students, IB or Cambridge students, get over NCEA students. This is the paper that we're talking about, because I did Cambridge myself, and if you've done Cambridge or NCEA in year 13, or either A2 chemistry or something like that, the pre-existing knowledge that you have in Chem 110 is around like 60 to 70% of the knowledge in Chem 110 is kind of the stuff that you've done in year 13. So it really gives you a huge edge over your peers who's only done NCEA level 3, which is, from what I've gathered, like only 15 to 20% of the pre-existing knowledge. So that's usually, but regardless of what high school qualifications you've done, that's usually the easiest one, because of the way the paper is structured, and you just need to do more practice. And then for the harder ones, some people would say that BioSci 107 is harder because it's lots of memorizations. Some people would say Population Health 111 is harder because it's kind of like the weird paper that no one has seen in the past. And usually lots of people tend to put lots of effort on BioSci 107 because there's lots of content. It's really content heavy, and we've got some examples to be showing you very soon. Usually I tend to hand these out in person if we're in person, but unfortunately we're live streaming. So usually lots of people spend lots of time on BioSci 107, and they kind of just neglect Population Health 111 because they think it's kind of conceptual and it's easy to understand, and how could it go wrong? But what actually happens is that in the test one, it's a multiple choice test one. I think it's worth around 25% from what I remember. And you really need to know the course kind of inside out and like back and forth, just because the way they ask you the question is really kind of, you need to understand everything to an extreme amount of detail, and usually people don't really do that because they tend to not really spend much time on that paper, and that's usually the one that kind of slams them, hit the wall for some people. So yeah, biosci and pop health, the more difficult ones, depends on what your style is. And now you might be thinking, how much content is there in first year? So I have some example lecture slides that I found from the bottom of my under my bed. Here you go. So this, I don't know if you guys can see it clearly. This can go back. Yeah, so this is one lecture of Biosci 107. So there's 4 lecture slides per page, and there's around 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 pages. So it's around 50 to 60 lecture slides, and every single one of them's packed with information. Like, I'm not sure if you guys can see it clearly, but it's all like lots of detail and lots of notes, and that's just one of them. And there's also other ones here. So yeah, don't worry about them. Basically, that's one lecture for Biosci 107, and each week you have 3 of those, and each one of them's 1 hour. So from the people that I've spoken to, and from just the general consensus is that each of those lectures is roughly equal to around like 2 to 3 weeks of high school biology. So if you have 3 of those a week, that's a couple of months worth of high school biology content that you need to know to a 90% level if you need to get an A+, if you want to get an A+. So that's 3 of them just for Biosci 107. And then there's also population health, which is relatively less content heavy, but then more conceptually, you need to know things conceptually. It's more conceptually challenging. And then there's also Chem 110. So if you think about it, you're covering kind of sort of every week, you're covering like probably 3 to 4 months worth of high school content in 1 week. And just before, and MedSci 142, that's actually the hardest one, because each of those lecture, one of them is roughly 2 Biosci 107. So what I've just shown you, probably like 2 of them would be equal to 1 lecture of MedSci 142, but that's in semester 2. The reason that we're emphasizing on the volume of content is that your test 1, which is for Biosci 107, it's worth 30%. So it's in the first kind of, it's basically it's examining you on the first 4 to 5 weeks of content. And even though you have a break in between before your test, sometimes it's before the semester break, sometimes it's after. I think in recent years it's after the sem break. It's worth 30%. So if you want to get an A+ for that paper, each paper is broken down into, there's the test and there's the exam, which is worth 40%, and then there's also labs, and then there's also some kind of group assignment, and usually some kind of online assessment as well. So given that you get above 90% for your group assignments, for your labs, for your online sort of assignments, if you kind of slacked off at the start of the year and you scored an 86% in the Biosci 107 test 1, which is worth 30%, that's still really good. You've known all that content, all those content to an 86% level. But that means that in order for you to attain an A+ at the end of the semester, in the final exam, you have to score, in order to make up for the 86%, you have to score around 92 to 93%, which is even harder because usually the first test covers kind of the first 5 weeks of content, whereas the exam covers the entire semester's worth of content. That is why we always tell students and people who come to us for advice that the first kind of, not even 4 to 5 weeks, because by that point, if you're only starting to work really hard by the semester break, is usually already too late because students are trying to cram things. Usually the first 2 to 3 weeks is the most important part, because that's usually the part where students tend to fall behind because they get overwhelmed by the volume of content. So the majority of students, they get overwhelmed in the first few weeks because they get to uni, they've got O week, they've moved into halls away from home, and then they spend a week or two kind of partying, and then another week or two adjusting to uni. By that time it's already week 4, and then you're already 3 to 4 months worth of high school content behind in your first year. They fall behind, try to catch up and cram lectures, during the sem break, during the mid-sem break or whatever. Still scores a below par test 1 result, usually below 85%. If you score an A, there's usually a decent chance that you can make up for it. It's going to be a bit more difficult, but you can still work with that. Usually people, when they get sort of like an A minus or below, they can't really compensate in the final exam because you have to score like really well. You have to score above 95% in order to make up for it. They get into Sem 2 with a subpar GPA, so under an A average. That's what we mentioned. It's usually, the odds are kind of against you when it comes to applying for med school. And then they don't have time to prepare for the UCAT and the interview because they're stressing over med-sci, and they want to kind of make sure that their study techniques are right, and they have a below average or kind of average UCAT interview, and they get declined from med school. So that's what we don't want to happen to you. So if we look at the number of students who's in the game for med school entry, at the start of semester 1, there's usually about 1,000 students who's actively thinking about applying to medical school or getting into medical school. So on the first day of your lectures, if you look at the person to your left, you look at the person to your right, chances are they have the same end goal as you. By the end of semester 1, start of semester 2, roughly half of them have given up on that goal because they have a below par semester 1 GPA, so they aren't even kind of in the game anymore. And then by the end of, not really by the end, by the middle of the semester, usually only half of those, we usually see around 250 to 300 students who gets interviewed by the med school, because the med school will just look at, how many places they're allocated to every year by the government in terms of medical school spaces, and they'll just kind of accordingly select the people according to their semester 1 GPA and see who they want to interview. And then once those students who's been selected for the interview gets interviewed, then the uni will look at your UCAT scores, your METSA 142 grades, and your interview scores. And then out of those 250 and 300 students from the first year who's interviewed, roughly around a third of them, or around 100 students, get accepted. That is why adapting to university, adapting to your first year biomedical health science at Auckland Uni in the first 2 to 4 weeks of semester 1 is the key to success. If you fall behind, if you kind of muck around and do things, just not taking it seriously, it's going to be really hard for you to catch up. So it's important for you to work hard and get a head start so that you can have a really kind of chill, or not chill, but more relaxed, way for you to do the rest of the year. And we're going to talk a bit about the interview, like we said. And the interview is only at Auckland Uni. So if you're applying through Otago Health Science first year, there's no interview. So the interview is a multiple mini interview. So I'm sure when most of you think about the interview, it's kind of like a panel interview. So it's kind of like you being in front of sort of 4 to 5 interviewers, and they're kind of interrogating you, kind of thing. This is not what happens in a multiple mini interview. What happens is that at Auckland Uni, at least, it's broken down into 8 different stations, and each station is independent. So you have 1 or 2 interviewers for that station for that particular question, and if you screwed up in that station, you can happily move on and start off fresh and renewed in the next station. So at Auckland Uni, there's 8 stations. 7 of them are actual questions that you answer and you discuss with the interviewer, and one of the stations is a resting station, and that can happen anywhere between the 7 stations. And the interview is also online. So in the past, it used to be in person. There used to also be an acting station. I'm pretty sure from what I've heard, they've gotten rid of it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's online. So for each station, each question, it's 8 minutes in total, so 64 minutes in total. 2 minutes of reading time for each question, 6 minutes to answer it. And then once you answer the question, there's follow-ups and interviewer. So you're not expected to speak for 6 minutes in total. You're expected to, usually people speak for probably around 1.5 to 2 minutes, answer the question, and then the interviewer will kind of look at your answer or think about your answer and kind of ask you some follow-up questions to prompt you so that it can help you with the marking. So this is the below kind of 7 breakdowns is what we got from Auckland Uni. It's career choice, personal insight, personal experience, all of these things. So we'll just go through them briefly with you here because there's lots of things that we have to go through today. So career choice, a question like that would be something like, basically wanting you to know about the career as a doctor. So, or why you chose to be a doctor kind of thing. So an example would be, how does your extracurricular things or your hobbies help you become a better doctor, and how does that help you? And sometimes, it could come up with personal insight or personal experience. Personal insight would be knowing about yourself, so knowing about your strengths and your weaknesses, how you perform in teamwork, in a team, what you're good at and what you're not good at. If you can back that up with personal experience, volunteering or things like that, that will be good. Yeah.
Yeah, then they have healthcare issues. So there's really often a question about rural health. This one's a bit easier to prepare for because you do just need to kind of educate yourself. In terms of rural health, they want you to know why people living in rural communities are more likely to have poor health outcomes. This can be like a bullet pointed list you can have in your head, such as things like the actual distance. So they might not have a GP that's less than an hour away, so that's going to take a lot of time to get to the doctor. That's going to be petrol money, that's going to be time off work, that's going to be putting the kids in childcare. All of those things add up, and then that person just might avoid going to the doctor. Then their condition might worsen, and then they might not have as good of an outcome as someone would have living in an urban community that's closer to a doctor. Other examples could just be infrastructure, depending on the location, there might be floods or broken roads, things that can't really access where they live. Resources as well, the most north MRI machine is in Whangarei, which you guys might not know where that is, but it's about 2 hours north from Auckland. And so if you live anywhere north of Whangarei, so if you live in Kaitaia, which is 3-4 hours from Whangarei, there's no MRI machine until a 4-hour drive, and that's a huge burden on you, on the healthcare community, if you need a scan. And as you can understand, a lot of people would probably just rather avoid it because they don't really know how serious it could be. So just brush up on, I would recommend reading a little bit about rural health outcomes. Have a few bullet points in your head on why people living further away in rural communities are more likely to have poor health outcomes and poor health. So that's that one. In terms
just to chip in, there's also things that you can do. Sometimes they ask you questions in the media, in the news. So there's things like the junior doctor strikes that's going on, nursing strikes that's going on, things like that. They could ask you those things in what's happening in real life in New Zealand at the moment. So make sure that you don't just kind of be burying your head in the textbooks, and make sure you actually know about what's happening in the world, and especially in the New Zealand healthcare context. Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of inequity, there's usually a question about LGBTQ plus health and treatment. This one, they're kind of just assessing that you are not going to bring discrimination or disrespect into your practice, and that you're going to be able to treat everyone fairly and equitably, or whatever that word is. So the question that I got for this was, how would you make someone that identifies as transgender more comfortable in the waiting room? So that's just something to think about. You can do lots of different approaches. I ended up saying everyone needs to be on the same team in terms of the healthcare system having rules against discrimination, and everyone needs to be aware of that when they come onto the working at the place, or as a patient you need to not be rude to your other peers. In terms of Haura Māori, there's also often a question on this. This one's a lot more historical, so they really want you to go way, way, way back to colonization times and think about why Māori are such disadvantage in these days, and especially in the healthcare system, and how colonization actually led to that. So again, like, read up on the history, know a clear path of how and why colonization has led to poor health outcomes. But like Harry said, you also want to know what's going on right now and how we're seeing that like come to fruition in kind of the health system today.
Yeah, so an example would be things like how the new coalition government abolished the Māori Health Authority, and how do you think that's going to affect, Māori health outcomes and things like that. And the final one that I'm going to be talking about is ethics and morality questions. Now, this is usually the kind of difficult question that people think about when it comes to medical school interviews. So, the question that I got is, imagine a scenario where or you're an eye doctor, and there's an elderly patient or kind of middle-aged patient coming in, trying to get an eye test in order for them to pass the driving license, in order for them to qualify to get the driving license, and they fail. But then they insist that they're going to walk away and drive the car anyway because there's no other option for them. What would you do as a doctor? So yeah, it's kind of tricky because there's lots of aspects or scenarios that you have to think about in a kind of conflicting or situation like that, when there's ethical dilemmas. So there's different approaches. So one thing that you can do is you can break down the scenario into a pros and cons approach. So it's like, the pros of letting this patient walk away would be blah blah blah, and the cons would be, they might drive around and harm people or something like that. Or the pros of getting in some way, making sure that they don't leave is and the cons would be something. A better way would be, for example, you can break it down into the elements of the scenario. So you can think about, like, what's something that I don't know. Uncertainty is always a good thing, not to never assume anything about the patient. What's something I don't know about this patient? For example, if the follow-up question that I got was, what are you going to do as a doctor if the patient tells you that he lives in a rural area and he doesn't have access to any public transport, and he's got a family to support and he has to get to work, things like that. So they can combine different topics from above to into a question as well. Some other things that you can think about would be like the idea of a greater good. So, obviously you let them go away. They could you don't want someone to go out there and be harming the public because of their own kind of personal choice. Also, you can think about, what's your role as a healthcare professional? So as a doctor, your job is to make sure that the patient is well informed, make sure that they're making an informed decision, and make sure that you put the patient's health and safety in the number one. It's actually crossing the professional boundary if you choose to, step out of line and be like, no, you can't leave the practice, otherwise I'm going to stop you from doing something, that's not really your role. So there's lots of aspects, lots of elements that you think about. It's important for you to have a framework for you to latch your answer on, just because, like, if you think about it, there's 8 minutes, you only get 2 minutes to read the question and formulate a response. And there's not much time. So if you have a framework to latch your answer onto, it makes it way more easier for you to come up with a good answer, to communicate it with the interviewer so that they can know what you're thinking, know what's going through your mind, and they can ask you relevant follow-up questions to help them to score you in your station.
Just another thing with the MMI, Auckland does a mock MMI where, like, it's run exactly the same kind of structure. You've got the 8 stations, different interviewer at each, but it's a mock one, so it's practice. This was, I don't know, maybe a month or two ago, and I was a practice, like, I don't know, what do you call it, tutor for this.
Practice interviewer.
Yeah, interviewer. Yeah. And I ran the real health question, and I'll just say it's really, really obvious if you memorize an answer. So we've given you kind of like all the things they're going to ask. If you just go home and memorize, like, word for word, I'm going to say this, the interviewers can definitely tell, and they don't like that. They want to see that you're genuine, that you can adapt, that you have like your own kind of pattern of thoughts, and you can develop your own opinions, but also back them up with logic and reason. And like, the best thing to do is, if you don't understand a question or if you don't have a good answer, just say, like, I'm unsure because XYZ, I would go ask this person, rather than just making something up that you've memorized that doesn't really make sense, because it is really obvious as an interviewer that we can see that.
Yeah, so that especially goes to your career choice and personal insight questions, because these are things that you can't really, like, you have to be the key is to be genuine, be authentic, have a framework that you lash your answer onto, and don't lie. I had someone who I was tutoring who I told them not to lie, and they lied in an interview, got rejected straight away. They had an 8.5 GPA. So the key to Auckland pre-med success, there's grades, there's UCAT, which Chanel's going to be talking about, and there's the interview that we've just talked about. For the grades, the minimum requirement for the uni to look at your application, you have to pass all 8 papers, and you have to have an above 6.0 GPA across all of those papers. The average grade, or the median grade to be accepted, is 8.5 to an 8.75 GPA, which is 3 A pluses or 2 A pluses and 2 or 1 A's. And then 4 core papers in total, 3 of them in semester 1. That's why you need to go very hard in the first month. Try to aim for above 95% in test 1. So personally for me, in the Biosci 107 test 1, I scored around 97%. So I managed to be really kind of relaxed for the rest of the semester. And for my pop health test 1, I think I scored at like 89%. So I was a bit kind of stressed, but I managed to get the 3 A pluses anyway. So aim for 3 A pluses in semester 1, and then focus on interview prep in semester 2, because you have way more leeway in terms of studying and grades and the time, and you probably have some time to study for the UCAT during the break as well. Yeah, and then for the interview, knowing about the career, that's career choice, knowing about yourself, that's personal insight and personal experience, knowing about the New Zealand healthcare issues, which is kind of the healthcare issues and equities and how to Māori, and ethics and morality, just be a good person, and then know what to say, have the knowledge, have the maturity, have the insight, but also know how to say it, have a structure, and know how to communicate it across to the interviewer. That's one of the most important things. Yeah, pass it on to you.
Cool, so we'll just go into Otago Pre-Med now, which is Otago first year house sci. So as Harry mentioned, it's very different to Auckland in the sense that your application is 100% your GPA. The UCAT is a threshold, so they don't actually look at your numbers. We'll go into that later, and there is absolutely no interview for Otago. So in semester 1, similar to Auckland, you've got 4 papers. These are all core papers. There's hubs, which is human body systems, chemistry, physics, and cells. Chemistry and physics are both multi-choice in the final exam, which some people like. Cells is generally the easier one. It's kind of like high school biology, cells, and things like that. And hubs is generally new content because it's like human body systems, but more enjoyable. And those are all core papers. In semester 2, you've got 3 core papers, which is human body systems, another one but different systems, biochemistry, and pop health. So biochem and pop health, I would say, are a lot more difficult compared to the Sem 1 papers because it's a bit more conceptual and less rote memory, but there's still rote memory, so you've got to be having both. And then in semester 2, there's actually an optional 8th paper. So you might be thinking, why would I do an 8th paper? Assuming that you've passed all your papers, they only look at the top 7 for your grades. So say for me, I got A+ for, in semester 1, I got A+ for hubs, physics, and cells, and I got an A in chem. And I thought, okay, I should do an optional 8 paper to try and get rid of that A that I got in chem and replace it with an A+. So generally people take easier papers, which are like statistics, or there's a multi-paper that is like really well taught. So you can do those in an attempt to try and bump up your grade if you got like one paper that you passed but the grade wasn't ideal. The cons to this, I guess, is it is a whole nother paper because you still need to pass the other 3, so that's more workload. I had some friends who didn't want to do an 8th. They thought they would be better off focusing on 3 papers to decrease the workload, and they'd be able to get better grades for those 3. And that worked out for them, and that was fine. Whereas I did the optional 8th, I got my A+, and I was able to replace chem with the A+. So I got really good grades in all of those. Yep, and in terms of structure, there was 3 lectures per week, similar to Auckland, and you do have a lot of labs. So each lab is 3 hours, and you have usually two of these labs a week. The subject changes. And you have to go to these because there's usually exit tests. There's tests at the end of these labs, and that counts towards your final mark. There's tutorials, lab tests, which I mentioned, and progress tests throughout the semester. The progress tests are similar to Auckland, so they're around 20 to 30%, except for physics, which does plusage. So if you did really bad in your progress test, but you got like a 96% in your final exam, they would just ignore your mid-semester test and take the 96 that you got in your final exam.
Yeah. And as regard to the labs at Auckland Uni, it's also 3 hours, and usually it's some point in the afternoon until like kind of 6 p.m. kind of thing. And for physics, when Chanel mentioned physics at Auckland Uni, it's not a core paper, so some people are concerned about physics. Like we mentioned before, as long as you pass it, as long as you have an average of above a 6, physics is not usually a problem for anyone who's applying at Auckland.
So in summary for Otago Health Science, there's 7 core papers that they give you, and you need to pass all of these with at least a 65%. There is an optional 8th paper if you want to bump your GPA, because the med school takes your top 7. The UCAT is based on a threshold, and we'll talk about this after this, but they generally only look at verbal reasoning and situational judgment. This does kind of change, but over the trends it's generally been these 2. And for the threshold, you only have to be above the bottom 20%. So compared to Auckland, the workload is a lot because you've got 4 core papers each semester, depending on if you do the 8th, and that's spread over both semesters. So you kind of have to maintain your motivation and your hard work throughout that whole year. Cool. So these are some grades for Otago. So you can see that they kind of get higher, and they're generally above a 92, so you need definitely an A+ average. The 2021 year is 95. That's just a bit higher because they got a grade bump because of COVID. And you can see that they're not letters. They're not GPA in terms of how Auckland was like 8.5, 8.75. This is because they're a lot more specific on your grade because they don't have the interview to look at, and they don't count your UCAT marks because it's only a threshold. So for an example, if Harry got a 95 average and I got a 94 average, they would take him because they do look at that, like the number difference, even if it's small, they will. So even if we both had an A+ average, his A+ average would be higher, so they'd take him. So it does matter, like the actual number you get, not just the letter. So you could get an A+, but it might be a low A+. I know a friend who got straight A+, she got like 92, 93 on all papers and didn't get in because they were like low A+. UCAT. So you might be wondering, okay, Chanel, you said that you got all these A+, why didn't you get in? Lo and behold, the UCAT. So people do mention that it's a threshold and it is low. However, you do need to take it seriously because they look at VR and SJ, and generally the hardest one is verbal reasoning because it's a lot of reading, a lot of comprehension, and it's the least amount of time. The UCAT questions, as I'm sure you've all looked at, aren't actually hard inherently. It's just the speed you have to do them in. So verbal reasoning is the most time-pressured one, and that's the one that they look at the most. Same with situational judgment. That's less time-pressured, but that also has a lower threshold. So for Otago, they only look at these 2 to 3 subsections, which is VR and situational judgment. For dentistry, they also look at decision-making. You just need to be above the lowest 20% of test takers. So this is everyone in Australia and New Zealand, which sounds quite easy, but for me, I didn't really study for the UCAT. I didn't really take it seriously because I thought that the threshold was really low, and yeah, I was like 1 mark off the cutoff, and once the med school saw my UCAT result, they didn't even look at the rest of my grades because I didn't meet that threshold. So this is what Otago Uni said. They said that the threshold for admission was just above the 20th percentile for VR and SJ, which includes the top 80% of people, according to UCAT. And for verbal reasoning, this was 520 or higher. So I got 510, which is a pretty bad score, but it's also just kind of luck on the day, what questions you get. In my mocks, I was getting much higher marks, and I practiced a tiny bit beforehand, but yeah, it does kind of come down to what you get on the day.
Yeah, it's the same for me. So it's very interesting when it comes to UCAT because it depends on how confident are you in terms of passing the threshold? Because, for example, for me, I actually scored for the verbal reasoning. I actually for my year, I think the cutoff was 540 for verbal reasoning, and I scored 530. So it was actually under the threshold for Otago, but I was at Auckland, so I was managed to be able to get in. So if there's the roles have reversed, if Chanel was at Auckland and she scored below the threshold, she might have gotten in. Whereas if I was at Otago, despite all my A+ grades, I wouldn't have gotten in because I scored below the threshold for Otago. So it really depends on your kind of personal confidence in terms of the UCAT, in terms of whether or not you can score above the threshold.
Yeah, and I guess with that, it's good because in Auckland, if you do the UCAT and you're kind of bad at one section, you can make up for it in other sections to get a better overall score. Whereas if you're bad at verbal reasoning, you can't do anything about that. Well, you can practice, but like you can't change their marking scheme, and they do look at verbal reasoning. But I guess just play to your strengths and weaknesses. Like if you think you'd be good at interview, then go like for Auckland. That might be better. If you think you're better at like verbal reasoning and getting good grades throughout the year, then do Otago. So overall, you should know how you learn and how you study. You need to know this before you start because you don't have time to adapt when in your first few weeks of uni. You want to start with a bang. A lot of people get caught up in the partying, especially if you're going to Otago. There's a big culture and it all seems very exciting because you're away from your family. But a lot of people get caught up in this and fall behind. You've got lots of time to party in your rest of your uni career and your life, and it's just really not worth it because those first few months of uni can like determine if you are doing a medical degree or not, which for a lot of people is like what they really want. Build habits and stay consistent. I had a checklist every day and I just took one day at a time. Have I done this notes? Have I done this? Yep, cool. Like then I can have my free time. And if you just do it each day by day, then like it's definitely doable. Go to all the tutorials you can. They often have free resources and tutorials at each hall. If you're in certain groups, like if you're not in a hall, if you're in a flat, they had tutorials for that. And don't be like me and not take the UCAT seriously because it does matter, and no matter what uni you go to, it does play a part. Cool, so Harry's just going to talk a little bit about something we have planned for you guys in January.
Yeah, so this is the special bonus that we mentioned in the email that we sent to you. And with all the information that we've given you, we were developing a January 2025 pre-med boot camp. So it's called Crash Med. So that will include, it'll be a 5-day in-person boot camp. 2 of the core papers, so Biosci 107 and Population Health 101, and it's going to be in Auckland. And there's going to be additional resources for students on the final days for the students who wants to prepare beyond our boot camp. So they want to go home in February and just learn more about things to get themselves, to make sure that they have a head start. And, if you want to learn more details, we're going to be sending out information in the next day or two about the boot camp. And just if you want to learn more details, just email back and say you're interested. And yeah.
Yeah, the thing with this as well, the way we did it in this model is because a lot of people do offer pre-med tutoring, like one-on-one tutoring, but the reason we don't think that's as effective is because one-on-one tutoring is super expensive, and we do want this to be affordable for everyone to be able to attend. And 2, the content in like first year isn't necessarily hard. Like you're not going to look at it and go, this makes 0 sense, I don't get it, I'm going to like really struggle. It's just a lot of volume. So the thing to overcome that is doing a slight bit of preparation beforehand to get a good foundation and to be able to build on that when you get to uni, which is what we're trying to achieve here, giving you guys a good foundation of the most important core papers, the MMI and the UCAT stuff. And we're doing it in January, like right before the course starts, so you're fresh, it's in your head and you're kind of ready to go. So yeah, this is a bit more about us and our grades and what we're doing at the moment. Yeah. And
finally, just any questions?
And we'll have some time for questions now, so just put in the chat if you've got anything you want to ask about, like your pathway, what's best for you, anything about Otago, about Auckland. This QR code is just a feedback form, so we would really appreciate it if you just take 30 seconds to fill this out. We're just trying to figure out what you guys find most valuable in terms of pre-med info and what you find not so valuable. So we'd really appreciate it if you could do that. We'll hang around for a few minutes for some questions, so just put them in the chat if you have any. And yeah.
Yeah.
I guess just while we're waiting for any questions to come through, I'll just mention postgrad as well. So as I said, I didn't get in first year because of my UCAT score, but I still had a high GPA, which was good because that set me up for my postgrad application. The postgrad GPA cutoff is generally a little bit lower, especially if you're rural or disability or refugee or something like that. And it is only an extra 2 years and you get a whole degree out of it, which is really helpful. So definitely recommend.
Yep. So a question came through for Auckland Uni. How long are the labs, and are they each day? It depends on your lab stream. How long are the labs? It's usually around 3 hours. It might go over time just because for some courses there's a end of lab test kind of thing that contributes towards your lab grades. Yeah, it's usually 3 hours. It's usually in the afternoon. From what I've recorded, I think all of them are in the afternoon. I think it's either 2 to 5 or sometimes it can go until like 6 o'clock if there's lots of people. Um, are they each day? They're not each day. Usually there's I think usually there's one to two a week kind of thing, or like once a week. That's definitely not each day. From the Yeah, you'll have to look at your timetable, the one that you select on student services online. Yeah, hopefully that helps.
Yeah, Otago's pretty unlucky. There's like a late night stream, so you can get stuck in a stream which is from 6 p.m. till 9 p.m. Just because they have so many students doing it. Like they do the morning, midday, and the evening. So yeah, you might get unlucky with that, but just got to do it.
And on the screen, those are our email addresses as well. So if you're too shy and you want to kind of email us privately about your questions, feel free to do so.
Yeah. Cool. We'll just wait till 2 more minutes and then we'll finish up. So put in any last final questions.
All right, final minute. Yeah, we'll stick around for another 60 seconds. So if you have any questions, be sure to send them through now.
Cool.
Cool. That's it. So we're going to end the stream now. Thank you guys all for attending. If you have any questions, feel free to email us, and we're going to be sending out the information about the bootcamp that we're developing in the next day or two. So just keep an eye on your email inboxes. Awesome.